and I'm really interested in the concepts that about banning and ordinances and zoning. I'm a resident of Bedford-Stuyvesant, and could really see that as being a positive solution. But it also seems related to me to some of the things around banning of soft drinks and some equity or conflicts around whether or not that's really giving people the freedom of choice. From my perspective, I think the solution to that is to not do banning ordinances in, without other solutions. So not just restricting what's available, but also, on what Dara was saying about making more available in terms of farmers markets and other types of solutions.
We talked a lot about legislation and policies both here in New York and elsewhere, and I'm hoping you can all talk a little bit more about the role of our elected officials in making sure that policies are both including and benefiting those who perhaps need it the most.
We have to pay attention to racial hierarchy and to white supremacy, and the fact that black neighborhoods are redlined for retail. That's not going to sort of go away all of a sudden because you have a ban on fast food. That's not going to somehow now make the stores you want to magically appear, right? So there's that. And but I think what's interesting about and all these other cities though, Concord, Massachusetts, Calistoga in California, Solvang, they use different kinds of foci for their zoning. So the interest is about, well, it sort of blights, neighborhoods that have this very special character and prestige, and it disrupts the land use and so on. And I think what's interesting is if we think about the history of this country, racial zoning used to very explicitly ban black people from whole sections of the city and so on, and restrict them to the least amenable kinds of land uses and so on. So it's an opportunity to really take something that has been used to the detriment and actually create a zone of health if that's how it's implemented. I think with regard to the elected officials, I think something that's interesting about that is if you look at the zoning language, it's very sort of cut and dried around, it's trying to protect a special kind of commercial character or something like that, where Dolores Hayden, she's at Yale in the School of Planning and Architecture, and she wrote this book, A Field Guide to Sprawl, and in it she points out that when you're trying to affect change, you can use sort of more neutral language because it's less of it's kind of less offensive to officials or to decision makers, and you can do that. But then at the same time, so it's maybe less offensive or less people will be less intimidated or bristled by it. But at the same time, it's also easier to ignore. So I think what would be useful in a zoning approach, were the city, currently it seems like New York City's charter doesn't allow for you to do that kind of zoning, but if you were to try that approach, I think it would be beneficial to be very explicit about, instead of having a whereas the obesity rate is X, Y, and Z, the whereas would be whereas black neighborhoods have been systematically redlined, whereas the level of segregation persists, and be very explicit and potentially more confrontational. But if you don't name something as what it is, you can't address it.
Someone is going to have to navigate a number of systems to get the kind of services and support that they need. So how can you be an access point, an entry point to helping navigate that? And how can we actually think about across agency, how we bundle and package services so that there's one entry point. I don't know if anyone's ever had to apply for food stamps or welfare. It is the most humiliating and long drawn out process ever, right? And so how do we actually begin to shift the way people are experiencing government and experiencing the policies that we're enacting, right? So I would start there. I think also just as a student, a university has a tremendous amount of power, and they also have the investments they make, the land that they own. There's a history behind that. I would encourage all of you that are students to look up the history of CUNY, to look up, what is their relationship with race and racism. And I think first and foremost, what officials could and should do is really think about what we call TAP, which is transparency, accountability, and participatory processes, right? We can diagnose the problem all day. I think that, there are folks who are facing these problems that have really good ideas, that, those that are most impacted are living within this, are innovating through it. And so really harnessing the power and understanding the power in community, and thinking about how do we actually demystify some of these government processes to make them more accessible for people. There are cities that have used the trusted advocate model to really do this, which is thinking about unlikely allies, like a Little League coach or a basketball coach or somebody in a neighborhood that has deep connections, and really bringing them to the issue and connecting them to the issue and allowing their networks to be what we use to do outreach. I think thinking about community food projects, how do we get credit and financing that has been systematically denied? Loan quality, race is still the #1 predictor of loan quality, right? That's not an accident, that's by design. And so when we're thinking about credit and financing, when we're thinking about development projects as elected officials coming into your neighborhood, who are going to be the owners and producers of those? You know, what does it look like for local jobs? Who's going to be in those jobs, et cetera, et cetera. And again, land is so critical to that conversation. And then finally, just the other thing that Nick mentioned in his opening was the health in all policies approach. So when we're making investments, when we're making policy decisions, there are critical questions we can ask ourselves about the unintended consequences of the things that we're doing, of the decisions that we're making.
What is the role of agricultural subsidy policies in this access to quality food, and how does subsidy policies play into this race component to access to quality food?
I've been talking about structural racism for a proverbial historical minute, and have been looked at as if I'm polka dotting from Mars, you know. But it's absolutely, that's absolutely the game in town. You know, to talk about a positive initiative, there's a community on the Lower East Side. The community board chose to honor the community's choice around determining a community garden district, i.e. zoning. So, you know, this is the beginning, first initial steps in terms of using zoning as a tool. But, you know, Dara raised something called Black Lives Matter. Yes, and we often think about that from the cultural racism perspective, meaning, oh, these are individuals that look, they're really looking at it. But Black Lives Matter from a structural racism perspective in terms of processes. So, you know, when you look at community boards, and you're talking about the universal land use review procedure, community boards, when communities decide they want to do something, guess what? That community board vote, when it goes up the chain of decision making, borough board, city planning, and on up the chain, that vote is looked at as advisory. In other words, we're looked at as children, and that, you know, we're here playing house. So that's something of a structural nature. Then the makeup of the planning commission is very real estate biased, so that's something, that's an entry point that we have to look at. Want to highlight a really positive point in terms of governance for the elected official that was here. I don't know if she still is. Participatory budgeting is actually what is participatory democracy. It's where elected officials defer to the local tax-paying community at the very hyper-local neighborhood level, and they allow the residents to have a discretion over how their tax dollars get spent. So, for example, in Mott Haven, the community was able to vote for a food production solar-powered greenhouse on public housing land as a result of a participatory democratic initiative known as participatory budgeting. So how do we use that as a template in terms of participatory planning? We really have to drive this. And so I just want to say, for all of you that are gathered here, I said this at the Food Forum back in October, and I just want to put the challenge out to folks here that are gathered. If you're interested in really looking at the nuts and bolts, A to Z, nitty-gritty, I am willing to get together with you guys. We have folks here. We need to do this. We need to get beyond conversation. We need to get beyond research. We need to get beyond analysis, and we need to get to action. I think we have enough analysis here in this room so that we can inform really good, impactful action.
Teachers and the UFT is absolutely in a war with the private equity groups and with private money-making charter schools, but the profit-making aspect of education. And I think, and this fight between private and public is so very important. And I think this is absolutely, in what I'm listening to and what I'm hearing, is that it's really important, and you say a misdiagnosis of a problem. And I think it's very important that often I don't hear about profit. and how much money is being made. The only reason why people want to go into in communities of color and other places with charter schools is to make money. And I think, one of the things I love about the fast food workers, and I do love them, and I really respect them so much, and that they're fight for $15 an hour and more, I hope. But they should make part of the profit. They should be profit sharing with the corporate barons. But what they're hurting the corporations. That's my point. They are hurting, and that's why things are changing a little bit. They are hurting the profit. And I think without a discussion, an equitable food system, without a discussion, and you say who is benefiting, and definitely right now in America it's profit. That's where things go, and I love what people are saying because I think there's so much more than that. But the fight between this private profit and this public good is waging in America right now, and you can see it in education and you can see it in food policy, which I'm learning about. I'm very grateful to learn more through this discussion. But that is the bottom line.
There's something, health literacy and illiteracy. Some people, even when they have health problems, they cannot connect how it is. They cannot understand how it is that they should be changing their food habits, so gradual changes, and it's a lot to teach them, and I'd like to see people think about that we have a problem of health literacy in this country.
My mission in the work that I do is to uncomplicate health, and I feel like so much of our system has been commodified, and to the last point, it's all about profit, and and so how do we demystify a lot of that work? I used to run a mobile grocery store. We turned a public bus into a grocery store in Chicago. And I had people coming on the bus. I actually used to work with WIC centers. And they would come on the bus and they would say, and all we sold was fresh fruits and vegetables, right? They would come on the bus and say, I have to go to the store to buy some baby food. And I was like, well, you're surrounded by baby food, right? And they're like, what? And I'm like, we got sweet potatoes, we got pears, we got, these are all bananas, we got avocado, right? Like, that's baby food. And so getting back to fruits and, basic fruits and vegetables, this is the center of your diet, moving your body, drinking water, it's simple, right? And so the complication, obviously there are some health issues that we end up having that complicates it. But just on some basic messages is what, as a community health worker, is what we're trying to do. Also with that, I'll just say the critical point about doing the work, especially in communities of color, is to not negate, again, the history of where we come from in health, in ag, right? And so there are so many people coming into our community, we call them parachuting into our communities, trying to teach us how to eat because we don't know anything as these empty vessels. And I will say, as a pushback to that, is to come from an asset-based approach and understanding and respecting and understanding all the assets in which communities of color bring. So it's so critical to do that as we do this.
The average American child between the ages of 2 and 18 spends more time watching television commercials for unhealthy food than all the hours they spend in a college classroom getting a degree. So not surprising that so many people should be nutrition illiterate when it is the food industry that is our primary nutrition educator. And I think, again, as a food movement, as educational institutions, as community-based organizations, we need to be asking, how can we counter those unhealthy messages and rely on community assets, local artists to develop other kinds of messages to develop a higher understanding of nutrition.
We subsidize bad food, and we don't even subsidize, for example, fruits and vegetable growers who tend to be Latino and Asian immigrants, right? So huge, very clear disparity, and really easy to look up that research. Happy to point you to that. Just on the point of Black Lives Matter, we at CSI have been talking about Black Lives Mattering, but also building communities where Black people can thrive. So not just leaving it at mattering, to your point about, Ray, about what's the action steps, but really how are we building and supporting communities where all people, where Black people can thrive. And on the point about participatory budgeting, I think participatory budgeting is absolutely crucial, and I think it's a strategy that has to be paired with building a bigger pie. Because if we're all fighting for scraps, because the participatory processes are still very localized and very small bits of money, but how at the same time are we pairing that with a strategy to get more money into our communities overall? In terms of white allies, I think it's the same conversation about resource and power sharing, about looking at the relationships you have, looking at how you do engagement, thinking about who do you support, what are the cross issues.
We're very good in this country about thinking about proximate causes, such as why people don't eat the right thing or why they don't have the health literacy they should have. And, but we don't, for example, Lincoln Phelan talk about, well, we can exhort people to wash your cutting board and do X, Y, and Z with your meat, but that's only necessary in a food system where contaminated food gets to your plate. And we don't think about that. So that's the fundamental cause. And so we should focus too much on the proximal ones, even though they are important. And then I was just going to say also about profit, that somehow profit and a very rational sort of operating market never seems to take place when it's desired resources in Black communities. So De Rosario and Williams, in their article on retail redlining, say, quote, chain stores willingly cede profitable inner city locations to independents while they saturate suburban, less profitable locations with their stores. This cannot be explained by any economic theory that we are aware of. Right? So which is true. I mean, depends on how you define profit. Even if you have an area that is lower in income, but there are lots and lots of people with high population density, they also have high buying power. But somehow stores don't see that as a profitable location because they're not valued as people. And so, when you think about profit and why certain stores locate where they do, it's more oftentimes than just the pure, logistics of money and profit.
And so I work with farmers, and we've also referenced that Corbin Hill is an essential model for us all to know about, and Dr. Derrick is here somewhere. And I guess I'd love to know if if the panelists have examples from other cities or regions that you've worked in where farmers have been involved in that decision-making process, and when and where we involve them, because production is part of that structure. And farmers want other options, just like communities here in the city want other options. So where and when do we involve them in that process, and how? And if you could share any examples, whether it's food box programs or farmers markets or other types of retail strategies, how should we do that?
I'm wondering if the panelists have any experience, either in New York or other cities, of anti-racism training for city agencies that can help us get to the root of it.
I'd love to hear examples that you have in mind of positive case studies of great communications programs that have been developed to engage people in communities or statewide or even nationally around these issues.
One of the things that we do at CSI is also race communication, so testing how people respond to messages and tweaking that to ensure that we can keep race on the table. What we hear repeatedly is that either we're post-racial or we can't talk about race. And I think that our message testing has shown that we can and that we absolutely have to. And so happy to share, we have an initial report of findings from focus grouping and actually testing of messages, and there's a new one that's set to be released very soon.
So let's use this energy and insight that we gained this morning to continue that discussion in our organizations, in our classrooms, in the streets, so that we can really begin to convert this insight and analysis into action.